Well, after that enlightening discussion of applied anthropology, you may be saying, I am sold. Or you might be saying, I am not sold. I already have a career path. No, thank you. And that's totally cool. And in that regard, though, you might be asking yourself, what if I don't want to be an anthropologist? Is any of this content from this class useful? I mean, it was useful to you in helping you fulfill a gen ed and get your degree, and that's awesome, and I'm so happy for that. And, I don't think college is just about jobs either. I think it's also about helping us be even more well-rounded and even more informed about our world. And so in that regard, hopefully this class was just relevant in that regard. Hopefully you better understand the cultural lives, social lives of us as human beings. Hopefully you better understand where we come from, how we are both culturally and biologically. Hopefully it's all very relevant to your life. I can think of few things as relevant to human beings as studying human beings. However, I think it's also appropriate to ask, does this feed into my course or to my career, right? Again, college is a lot of things, but one of the things increasingly that we think of it as is obviously job preparation. You're investing your time. You deserve to know, how things might fit into your career. And part of the chance to define that is up to you. I think part of it is up to you to define in each class, to look for those connections with your career and kind of think about how this applies. At the same time, I do think it's also partly on professors, at least I like to think it's on me, to try to do a little bit of that as well in class and try to define how things might be relevant, and at least to give a few ideas. So the idea of this is to give a few ideas. So I'm going to give you a few hypothetical and not so hypothetical examples of anthropology being relevant to somebody's career. So these are three different examples from jobs that have nothing to do with anthropology necessarily, but where anthropology would be really relevant. And I'm not saying these are the only three examples. I'm just saying these are like three that kind of came to me as I was preparing this lecture. So the first one is land and fishery management. So let's say, for example, we're thinking about some kind of major mine that's going in. And you'll forgive me that my examples are so often environmental, since that's sort of the direction that a lot of my research goes. But let's say you're working for state fish and game or federal fish and game, or that'd be U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or maybe you're working for Park Service, or maybe you're working for BLM, or maybe you're working for a fisheries board. Part of what groups like that are called in to consider and to weigh in on is issues of, should this mine go into place? Should this logging operation go into place? Should it go into place here or there? Should we put a windmill here? That kind of stuff. And when you're talking about something like that, there's often cultural things at play and not just sort of, what effects it's going to have on the wildlife. Take, for example, Pebble Mine, which is obviously a big issue here in Alaska, which people have a variety of different opinions about. We talk about it a lot more in my Alaska Native class, but you have, a proposed mine that EPA feels would have a really significant effect on the Bristol Bay fishery, which is a many $1-million fishery, right? That produces a whole lot of fishing and jobs for the state, but then there's a lot of minerals under there, and there's some there's some larger companies that want to make use of those minerals. And so it becomes this sort of debate. And, they've called in anthropologists to help advise on that as well, partly because of the effects that would have potentially and very likely on native fishers in the area, and kind of articulating some of that. But more generally, even if you're not an anthropologist consulting on that, let's say you're just like let's say that instead you're one of the people that's one of the land managers, again, working for Fish and Game or something like that. It behooves you, and it is helpful to you, to understand the cultural issues at stake, or to at least have kind of an orientation in that direction, just to even know that there might be issues, and then to kind of know how you might go about learning more about those issues, or what kinds of issues those might be, right? Sort of a basic, even if you're not an anthropologist, sort of a basic anthropological sensibility, that you're thinking about things like culture, you're thinking about things like subsistence, you're thinking about things like spiritual attachments to the land, you're thinking about things like framing and how people frame their arguments, like we talked about during the language lecture. Those types of things can really help you know who your decisions are affecting and who you should be talking to as stakeholders. Example number 2, psychological counseling. So you decided to go into counseling. That is great. We need counselors. We need good counselors. I've benefited from good counselors, and probably many of you have too. And I'm glad that we have them. But one of the things that any sort of counselor or therapist has to grapple with is that, you can know a lot about individual psychology, but you also need to know about culture and cultural background, because no individual is an island. You cannot understand mental health to the fullest extent if you don't understand how cultural and social backgrounds play into that. In my Alaska Native class, I have the students read something written by Harold Napoleon, who's Yupik, which is our largest, arguably, Alaska Native group here. And Harold Napoleon talks about substance abuse in the community where he's from and kind of in certain people that he's met. And he talks about the fact that kind of you have to see this not just as an individual issue or a biological issue or a psychological issue, but instead you have to think of it in terms of trauma that was experienced during massive epidemics that that Yupik communities faced in the early 1900s and mid 1900s, and how that then affected people's view about their culture and how they kind of internalized that as a lot of like keeping things in and a lot of repressed trauma, and how that affected parents who then affected their children, and kind of how that manifests today. So if you're trying to do addiction counseling or psychological counseling with somebody with substance abuse and you don't understand the histories of their community, you might be missing out on a really big piece of the puzzle that could help you in knowing how to best counsel them. There's also the fact that, as another example, if you're doing psychological counseling, oftentimes people come to psychological counselors because of romantic or sexual issues that they're encountering, but you need to understand people's religious backgrounds, among other things, when you try to understand that and why people might find certain kinds of things appropriate for them and certain kinds of things inappropriate for them, and how they think about these issues, all of which can be very profoundly affected by religion. People's class affects how they think about themselves and how they think about others. People's racial and ethnic backgrounds and kind of how they might have internalized stereotypes. So all of that, right, is an example of where having some sensibility to that can be really helpful for a psychologist. And then I put teaching anywhere diverse as my third example, but really I should just say teaching, because really I'm a big proponent of wherever you are, it's diverse, whether it's a very obvious form of diversity or not. Some places are more diverse, but I would argue that all places are diverse to some degree, or at least in most places. There are very few places that are fully homogenous, and so teaching, right, and knowing how to teach to a specific group or different groups of people. There's a really kind of silly is probably the wrong word. It's a kind of odd example, but I think it illustrates the point well. I know somebody that was doing teaching in a Native community, and in that Native community, it's not uncommon for people to raise their eyebrows when they're expressing shyness, but of course raising your eyebrows for many folks outside of that community within the United States, that's not what that means, and in fact it can often mean kind of a sarcastic look of disbelief. And so when this person that I know, this friend of mine, when they were teaching in this community, they initially took offense sort of to the way, or at least maybe not offense is too strong a word, but they were kind of taken aback until an elder in the community kind of explained, like, well, here's what that kind of gesture means in our community. And that's not unique to Native communities. Most communities have specific cultural histories that you kind of need to understand. Or let's talk about, for example, one of our earliest lectures about when we talked about kind of structural racism, and you kind of need to understand that stuff if you're going to be speaking to and trying to teach diverse populations and making sure that you're, I think, hopefully sort of working against inequalities rather than sort of perpetuating them or perpetuating stereotypes. And so again, I think a basic anthropological awareness, or just we could think of it as a basic social cultural awareness, is helpful. So really anywhere people are diverse, which is arguably everywhere, you need to know the kinds of things that anthropology encourages us to look to, which is things like context, especially both the cultural context and the language context, and also how we communicate, how we frame things, not taking that as sort of simple at face value, but understanding the complicated ways in which language works, which is what linguistic anthropologists look at and what we were talking about a couple of weeks ago. And also understanding histories, like we talked about at the start of this course. Maybe it's not terribly relevant for you to memorize why people had hand axes back in the day during the Acheulean archaeological period, but it is relevant to understand that people are products of their histories in part, and to understand and to value the importance of a historical long-term perspective. Cultural understanding and just an understanding of social behavior and the ways in which people are shaped profoundly by their environments, and that people are not just an island unto themselves. all of these things that anthropology points you towards and encourages us to delve into, long after you've forgotten 95% of what we talked about in class, long after you've forgotten what the A101 tradition is, you've probably already forgotten maybe, long after you've forgotten the superior wharf hypothesis, I hope you remember kind of the value set of anthropology as far as encouraging us to look for context and look for the context people find themselves in as you encounter human beings. With that in mind, actually, this is a really good place to pause. So let me pause for a minute and then start the video up again.